The ethics of the wise. While the servants of the enemy practice torture, at first glance it would appear that the wise of Middle-earth, despite both ample opportunities and pressing needs for information, choose not to torture prisoners. Even in The Hobbit, when King Thranduil of Mirkwood imprisons Thorin and his company of dwarves, and one could make a case that he does so wrongfully, motivated by both pride and greed, it is never suggested that he tortures them in any way other than the imprisonment itself. He gives them food and drink, and orders that they be untied to minimize their discomfort. But the most telling example of how the heroes treat their prisoners is the treatment of Gollum, or Smeagol, by Gandalf, Aragorn, and the elves. When Gandalf tells Gollum's story to Frodo, he explains, "The wood elves have him in prison, but they treat him with such kindness as they can find in their wise hearts." Later at the Council of Elrond, Aragorn summarizes the same story from his own perspective and repeats this information while also affirming Gandalf's suspicion that Smeagol had been tortured by Sauron. He is in prison, but no worse. He had suffered much. There is no doubt that he was tormented, and the fear of Sauron lies black on his heart. When also at the Council of Elrond, Legolas shares the bad news of Smeagol's escape, he also makes it clear that the elves had sought to treat him kindly and gently. Smeagol has escaped, not through the lack of watchfulness, but perhaps through over-kindliness. Gandalf bade us hope still for his cure, and we had not the heart to keep him ever in dungeons under the earth. Beyond treating Smeagol gently and kindly, two additional aspects of the elves' approach are worth noting. First, one of the motivations for the kind treatment is the hope that Smeagol may be cured. Part of the argument against torture is that the mistreatment of a prisoner would make the cure of that prisoner less likely. And as we shall explore later in this book, the notion of a cure is a very important one to Tolkien, even for characters like Saruman and Smeagol. The second noteworthy aspect of the elves' approach to Smeagol is the great lengths to which they go in treating their prisoner kindly. They are willing not only to go to considerable effort, but also to take considerable risks. The virtue of treating a prisoner well is worth paying a cost for. It is a principle espoused by Faramir. When his father, Denethor, chastises him for practicing gentleness or wanting to appear gentle, telling him, "Gentleness may be repaid with death," Faramir replies very simply, "So be it." What a powerful statement. The scene in Peter Jackson's film showing Faramir and his soldiers brutally kicking and beating the prisoner Gollum is entirely antithetical to the real character of Faramir, as described by Tolkien, as were many other aspects of Jackson's unfaithful portrayal of Faramir. We even see this principle practiced by Frodo when Smeagol becomes his prisoner. Though earlier in the story Frodo had heard of the treachery of Gollum and had wished him dead, when he actually meets the pitiful creature, he is much more merciful. Initially, he has Smeagol tied up in the elven rope, but the rope causes Smeagol to writhe and scream in agony. When Frodo becomes convinced that simply the touch of this elven rope torments Gollum, he is willing to remove it at great personal risk, rather than to act with the injustice or cruelty of tormenting his prisoner. These examples could be used to make a strong case that the ethic expressed in Tolkien's Middle-earth writings is that the torture of a prisoner, even in times of war, even in order to gain information that could be vital to that war, vital to the saving of countless lives, is wrong. Even the most desperate of circumstances, the possibility of horrific defeat by the forces of Sauron, do not justify desperate actions such as torture that would otherwise be understood clearly as evil. But there is one problem. Gandalf's treatment of Smeagol when he first finds him, and is still trying to get information from him, appears less kind. Even by Gandalf's own words, his treatment of his prisoner borders on something like torment or torture. Moreover, he does this specifically to get needed information. He describes the scene to Frodo. "I endured Gollum as long as I could, but the truth was desperately important, and in the end I had to be harsh. I put the fear of fire on him, and wrung the story out of him bit by bit, together with much snivelling and snarling. He thought he was misunderstood and ill-used." We must consider this troubling passage closely. It is not just that Smeagol thought he was ill-used. It is that Gandalf himself describes his treatment as harsh. Might not the same words used to describe Gandalf's treatment of Smeagol also be used of the practice of waterboarding prisoners at Guantanamo Bay? Except instead of the fear of fire, the Guantanamo interrogators sought to wring the story from their prisoners by putting in them the fear of water. So we ask, did Gandalf torture Gollum? And if so, was that act justified, as Gandalf seeks to justify it, by the fact that the truth was desperately important? Considering the passage closely, and considering also the character of Gandalf, 3 possible explanations, not necessarily exclusive of one another, come to mind. Since the argument that torture is immoral within the framework of Tolkien's Middle-earth seems elsewhere so strong, for me the most appealing explanation for the above passage is that Gandalf did not actually torture Gollum. He was simply speaking metaphorically when he speaks of wringing the story out of him. This explanation is not without merit. Consider Gandalf's earlier treatment of Bilbo when he was trying to get the true story of the ring from the Hobbit. Bilbo complains of harsh treatment from the wizard and of being badgered. Gandalf responds, "I had to badger you. I wanted the truth. It was important." Note the similarities. As with Gollum, Gandalf justifies his actions by stating the importance of discovering the truth. Yet Bilbo is clearly annoyed. To use the description of Gollum, Bilbo feels misunderstood and ill-used. Later on, Frodo recounts to Gandalf Bilbo's memory of this. "He told me the true story soon after I came to live here. He said you had pestered him till he told you." Yet despite Gandalf's words to Bilbo, it is difficult to imagine that Gandalf actually tortured Bilbo in any sense of the word, however pestered Bilbo might have felt. An even more vivid scene takes place when Gandalf tries to convince Bilbo to give up the ring, after his long-expected party, and the Hobbit resists. "It will be my turn to get angry soon," the wizard tells the Hobbit. "If you say that again, I shall. Then you will see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked." The narrator goes on to describe the scene. Gandalf took a step towards the Hobbit, and he seemed to grow tall and menacing. His shadow filled the little room. This must have appeared very threatening to Bilbo. Was Gandalf, like the orcs we discussed earlier, implying that he would harm the Hobbit if the Hobbit did not comply with his command? If so, it would be entirely out of character for Gandalf, who, as we will explore in Chapter 7, never tries to force others to act a certain way, but rather tries to encourage and strengthen people to make their own choices. More likely, Gandalf was simply responding to Bilbo's own threat. The Hobbit had, after all, let his hand stray to his sword. Gandalf was also, I think, both angry and afraid. Not afraid for himself, but afraid for his friend Bilbo. He cared deeply about the Hobbit, which is why we cannot imagine the wizard torturing Bilbo in any way. What if he treated Gollum in much the same way he treated Bilbo? Gollum, being much more given over to evil, might well perceive that behavior in a darker light, more akin to torture. This view is, as I said, an appealing possibility for the reader who believes that torture is wrong, and yet wants to admire Gandalf. Ends do not justify means. There is no end, we can well imagine Gandalf arguing, not even saving Middle-earth from Sauron, that would justify the means of torturing a sentient being. Unfortunately, this view of Gandalf is hard to reconcile with the words, "I put the fear of fire on him, and wrung the story out of him." Gandalf's own words, not Gollum's. The complexities of narratives and of life. There is, however, yet another answer. It neither affirms nor contradicts the above possibility, but simply explains the scene from a developing narrative need, rather than justifying or condemning it from a moral viewpoint. Keep in mind the history of Tolkien's development of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In the first edition of The Hobbit, published in 1937, the entire riddle contest between Bilbo and Gollum plays out somewhat differently. The riddles are the same, but the ending is not. In the first edition, when Bilbo, by sheer luck, wins the contest, Gollum simply lets him keep the ring as a reward or gift. The two then part amicably. It is as though the first published edition of the story was the version that Bilbo first tells the dwarves in order to justify his own claim on the ring. Of course, as Tolkien began to develop the concept of the One Ring while he wrote The Lord of the Rings, and he learned that Bilbo's ring was indeed Sauron's ring of power, this ending to the riddle game would no longer do. Tolkien needed to portray the ring as much more powerful, more evil, and more addicting than he had portrayed it in the first edition of The Hobbit. It was not merely something that was possessed by its owner, but something that possessed its owner. It would never be given away, at least not by one like Gollum, who was already by nature greedy and murderous. So even as Tolkien created a new edition of The Hobbit, with this new ending to the riddle game, and explained away the first edition's account as Bilbo's story told to the dwarves rather than the true story, he also began to develop his concept of the ring's power. In his pre-publication drafts of The Lord of the Rings, he slowly changes and adapts the dialogue between Gandalf and Frodo, in which the wizard presents to the young hobbit the history of the ring. In an unpublished version, somewhere between the first draft and the eventual published draft, Gandalf recounts to Frodo his interaction with Gollum as follows. "What I have told you is what Gollum was willing to tell, though not, of course, in the way I have reported it. Gollum is a liar, and you have to sift through his words. I fancy he had made up his mind what to say, if necessary, so that the stranger would accept the ring without suspicion, and think the gift natural. There was no need to tell the lie, of course, when he found the ring had gone, but he had told that lie to himself so many times in the darkness, trying to forget Diagol, that it slipped out whenever he spoke of the ring. He repeated it to me, but I laughed at him. He then told me more or less the true story, but with a lot of sniveling and snarling. He thought he was misunderstood and ill-treated." The changes from this earlier draft are interesting. Note what is present in this earlier version and what is not. Gollum is still a liar and does not immediately give the true story. He still snivels and snarls. When he does give the true story, he still feels misunderstood and ill-treated. But the resemblance ends there. In the earlier draft, Gandalf does not put the fear of fire into him. He does not wring the story out of him. He simply laughs at Gollum, and that's all it takes for Gollum to come out with the true story. All hint of torture that appears in the later final version is absent in this earlier version. Unfortunately, this version would not work. It simply does not convey the complete corruptive and enslaving power of the ring. In order to get across the nature of the ring, both its power and its evil, Tolkien was required to do more with this scene. He had to show just how difficult it would have been for Gandalf to get the truth from Gollum, and thus I believe he eventually moves to the final version, the version where Gandalf must be harsh, must use the fear of fire, must wring the story out of Gollum. Tolkien must do this to convince the reader just how much power the ring wields over its bearers. Without such a description at the start, not only does the scene at the crack of doom lose its power, but much of the entire narrative regarding the struggles of Frodo lose its power. I don't think Tolkien wrote that description of Gandalf and Gollum in order to justify the torture of a criminal, no matter how guilty that prisoner is. And Gandalf makes it clear that Gollum is indeed guilty and deserving of death. Rather, the scene is there to convey the power of the ring. And yet that scene did make it into the book. Gandalf did, by all appearances, and by his own admission, and use of the words fear and ring, do something to Gollum, something probably best described as torture, either physical or psychological, probably both. Desperate for knowledge, the wizard's treatment of his prisoner was not gentle. The description is there for narrative reasons, as the author wrestled with a difficult concept, and required the reader to understand the power of the One Ring. Yet even if Tolkien was not considering the moral implications of this action, at the time he revised the scene, even if the scene arose from primarily narrative considerations, to convey the power of the One Ring, that does not mean that the author did not eventually ponder the morality of Gandalf's actions. Sometime around March 1960, Tolkien wrote a typescript manuscript titled Orcs. It is, as the title suggests, an essay on the nature of the orcs, and was eventually published, posthumously, in the volume Morgoth's Ring, in the section Myths Transformed. Like many of the pieces in the volume, according to Tolkien's son Christopher, this essay had in the mind of the author some authority as a finished piece, possibly for inclusion in a published volume of the Silmarillion. In this essay, Tolkien explores the issue of the treatment of prisoners. But even before this wickedness of Morgoth was suspected, the wise in the elder days taught always that the orcs were not made by Melkor, and therefore were not in their origin evil. They might have become irredeemable, at least by elves and men, but they remained within the law. That is, that though of necessity, being the fingers of the hand of Morgoth, they must be fought with the utmost severity. They must not be dealt with in their own terms of cruelty and treachery. Captives must not be tormented, not even to discover information for the defense of the homes of elves and men. If any orcs surrendered and asked for mercy, they must be granted it, even at a cost. This was the teaching of the wise, though in the horror of the war it was not always heeded. This, then, is the third explanation for Gandalf's description of his treatment of Gollum. He did indeed torture Gollum at some level, although probably in a way not nearly as violent or awful as the way we imagine Sauron and the orcs torturing their prisoners. He did not use whips or other devices of torture, nor did he scar Gollum. But he may well have caused Gollum some physical pain, and certainly willingly caused him some psychological distress. He did so in desperation, and he did so wrongly. His torture of Gollum was, in Tolkien's fabric of Middle-earth, an immoral act. That at least is what the essay above makes clear. Tolkien was addressing the exact moral issue of this chapter, and he states a clear, strong, and straightforward conclusion. Captives must not be tormented, not even to discover information for the defense of the homes of elves and men. He goes on to lay out the very principle we see illustrated in the elves' treatment of Smeagol, and later in Frodo's treatment of him. They treat him with gentleness and mercy, even at personal risk or personal cost. Yet Tolkien also recognizes that beings of free will, even beings as good and wise as Gandalf, will sometimes fail morally. Gandalf passes the moral test of refusing the ring and refusing power, greatly though he felt the need for power. But at least once, in pursuit of knowledge, Gandalf failed the moral test. In the objective moral framework that defines what is right and wrong in Middle-earth, it is wrong to torture a prisoner under any circumstances for any purpose. It really is an instance of becoming the very enemy you are trying to defeat. And that, of course, is a moral lesson that applies to any age in which there is war.